Let's talk about confidence, Season 2, Episode 8, The Confidence Crash After Failure. Welcome to Let's Talk About Confidence. I'm John M. Walsh. This is the episode I've been most careful about writing because failure isn't an abstract concept, and the confidence crash that can follow it, that isn't either. For a lot of people, this is something they carry for years, something without ever quite naming what happened. You tried something significant, it didn't work, and somewhere in the aftermath, something shifted. Not just in the practical situation, that's recoverable, but in the internal one, the quiet belief that you can handle things, that you have the measure of yourself, that you're capable of stepping forward, doing something difficult without it ending badly. That belief took a hit, and it hasn't fully come back. Failure is survivable. What often isn't survivable is the story that we build around it. So today I want to talk honestly about what that confidence crash actually is, why it's so persistent, and what a genuine, not performative, recovery looks like. So let's start with the biology, because the confidence crash after significant failure is not a choice or a weakness, it's a neurological event. Failure, particularly public or failure in something that mattered, activates the brain's threat response system in exactly the same way physical pain does. Research from social neuroscience has shown that social rejection and professional failure use many of the same neural pathways as physical hurt. This is not metaphorical. Your brain processes the experience of significant failure similarly to the way it processes being hurt. And what does the brain do after being hurt? It learns to avoid the source of pain. It quickly, efficiently, and critically without waiting for your conscious permission. So in the aftermath of failure, the brain makes quiet, automatic adjustments. It increases the threat salience of similar situations. It lowers the risk tolerance for comparable actions, and it becomes more cautious, more attuned to downside risk, more reluctant to commit. And all of this happens below the level of conscious decision making. You don't choose to be more cautious after failure. Your brain chooses it for you, based on an ancient and very effective learning algorithm that runs on a simple principle. That was painful. Don't do that again. Let me give you an example of how this shows up. I worked with someone, let's call him David, who had led a major product launch that failed publicly. The product was pulled from the market within 6 months. There were internal reviews, there was press coverage. It was by any measure a significant professional failure. 2 years later, David was still affected by it, but not in obvious ways. He hadn't left the industry, he hadn't stopped working, but something had changed. He noticed he was slower to volunteer for visible projects. He found himself qualifying his opinions more than he used to. He was more likely to wait for consensus before committing to a direction. He described it as, I'm still performing, but I'm performing with the handbrake on. That's the brain's threat learning system at work. It registered the failure as dangerous, and it was now running a background process designed to prevent anything similar from happening again. David hadn't consciously decided to become more cautious. His brain had decided it for him. The neurological adjustment would be manageable enough on its own. The harder part is the story. Human beings are meaning-making creatures. We don't just experience events, we narrate them. And the narrative we construct about our failures has an extraordinary power to extend their impact far beyond the original event. A failure that lasts 3 months can cast shadows across years. Not because of what happened, but because of the story that was built around it. And these stories come in recognisable forms. I wasn't ready. I'm not cut out for that level. If it had been better, it wouldn't have happened. People saw me fail at that, and now they know. I thought I could do it, and I was wrong. The stories feel true because they're built on real events. The failure did happen. The consequences were real. The feeling in the room at that time was real. But stories and facts are different things. The story's an interpretation, and interpretations can be partial or simply wrong and still feel absolutely convincing from the inside. The confidence crash in most cases is maintained less by the failure itself, but by the story that followed it. Let me take you back to David for a moment. When I asked him to tell me the story of the product launch, he told me it's a story about his inadequacy. He'd missed warning signs. He'd been overconfident. He'd let his team down. When I asked him to tell me the facts, just the facts without interpretation, a different picture emerged. The market conditions had shifted unexpectedly. A key partnership had fallen through. Supply chain issues had created quality problems. His own decisions were one factor among many, and not clearly the decisive one. But the story he'd been carrying for 2 years wasn't a complex situation with multiple contributing factors. It was, I failed. The story had been running on repeat as well, reinforcing the confidence crash every time he revisited it. Let me be specific, because the crash after failure doesn't always look the same. Some people go quiet. They were previously visible, contributing ideas, taking positions, leading conversations. After the failure, they pull back. They still attend, they still produce, but they stop putting themselves forward in ways that feel risky. They become a reduced version of who they were. Some people become hyper-vigilant. They don't pull back, they tighten, they overprepare, they check and recheck. They manage every variable that can reach, because that one slipped before was the one that mattered. And that can never happen again. The anxiety doesn't show us silence, it shows us control. Some people just get busy. They throw themselves into activity in a way that looks like resilience from the outside. They're moving, producing, delivering, but the activity is partially a way of not feeling the loss, not processing the failure, not sitting in the difficult questions it raised. Some people change direction entirely. They leave the field, the industry, the type of work. Sometimes this is healthy evolution. Sometimes it's avoidance dressed as reinvention. There are different adaptations, but they share a root, a confidence that was shaken and hasn't yet found its footing again. Which pattern do you recognise in yourself? Before I talk about what helps, I want to name what doesn't, because a lot of well-meaning advice given to people after failure is either useless or actively harmful. Here's one: fail fast, fail forward, failure's just feedback. These phrases and the philosophy behind them are not wrong exactly, but they're often delivered too quickly before the person has had permission to simply register that something difficult happened. Confidence after failure isn't rebuilt by reframing the failure immediately into learning. That's a cognitive technique applied to an emotional wound. It can help eventually, but applied too soon, it bypasses the processing that actually needs to happen. Returning too quickly to the scene. Some people believe that getting back on the horse immediately is the answer. Sometimes it is, but if the neurological threat response is still active, if the story hasn't been examined, returning quickly to the scene of failure can deepen the anxiety rather than resolve it. The brain learns from experience. If you go back too soon and struggle again, you've just added more evidence to the case against yourself. Pretending it hasn't affected you. This is common among high performers. I don't dwell, I move on. It was a learning experience. That's not resilience, that's suppression. And suppression is a short-term strategy with long-term costs. The unprocessed failures don't disappear. It goes underground and shows up later, often as the kind of vague, generalised anxiety that people can't quite trace to its source. Seeking reassurance. Was it really that bad? Do people still think about it? Have I recovered my reputation? Reassurance feels good in that moment, but it doesn't rebuild confidence. It just creates a temporary relief that requires more reassurance to maintain. The confidence has to come from inside, or it's not really confidence. So what actually helps? Real recovery from a confidence crash is a process, not an event. It has roughly 3 stages. Stage 1 is accurate processing. Before you can rebuild, you need to understand clearly what actually happened. Not the catastrophised version, not the minimised version, the accurate version. What were the contributing factors? What part of this was within your control and what wasn't? And what did you do differently, specifically, practically, and what was genuinely outside your agency. This is not about distributing blame or finding excuses. It's about getting the record straight in your own head, because you cannot learn from a distorted account of events, and you cannot rebuild confidence on a foundation of inaccurate self-assessment. A useful exercise here is to write out the facts of what happened, just the facts. Then separately, write out your interpretation, the story you've been telling yourself. Then compare them. Where was the story added meaning that isn't necessarily supported by the facts? Stage 2 is separating the event from the identity. This is the most important stage and the hardest. You failed at something, that's true. You're not a failure, that's also true. These statements are not in conflict, but the brain, particularly after the threat response, has been activated, and it tends to collapse that distinction. The work here is deliberate. What the story says, I'm not capable of this. The question to ask is that a fact, or is that an interpretation of a single event? When the narrative says I can't trust my own judgment, the question is that actually supported by the full body of evidence or only by this one episode? You're not making a case for yourself, you're examining the evidence with the same rigour you'd apply to any other claim. And most of the time, the identity verdict the brain has issued isn't supported by the full record or the facts. Think of it this way. If your best friend had experienced this exact failure, would you conclude that they were fundamentally inadequate? Or would you see it as a difficult experience that they'd eventually grow from? And now offer yourself the same perspective. Stage 3 is the graduated re-engagement. Once the process has happened, once the story is accurate and the identity has been disentangled from the event, the path back is through action. Small, deliberate, appropriately scaled actions in the direction of what the failure made you doubt. Not a dramatic return to the highest stake version, something meaningful but manageable, a step that's real enough to produce evidence but not so large that failure would be devastating. The brain learns safety through repeated successful navigation of manageable challenges. Each completed step rewrites, slightly, the threat assessment laid down by the original failure. Now let me tell you how this played out with David. After we'd examined the story and separated the event from his identity, he didn't immediately volunteer for another product launch. That would have been too large a step. Instead, he started leading smaller innovation projects, visible enough to matter, contained enough to be manageable. Each one that went well gave his brain evidence that the original failure was a specific event, not a permanent condition. It took him about 18 months, but by the end of it he'd rebuilt not just his confidence, but something stronger that he'd had before, a confidence that had been tested and found its footing again. I want to close with a reframe on what we mean by resilience after failure. Resilience is often presented as bouncing back quickly, as being unaffected, as moving on without looking back. That's not resilience, that's performance. Real resilience includes being affected. It includes the pause to process what happened. It includes the honest examination of what went wrong and what you'd do differently. And it includes sitting in the discomfort long enough to actually learn from it. The people I've seen recover most completely from significant failure aren't the ones who bounce back fastest. They're the ones who took the failure seriously, examined it honestly, separated it from their identity and then rebuilt, slowly, deliberately, with evidence accumulated, step by step. That's not weakness, that's the actual process. And the confidence they rebuilt was often more solid than what they'd had before, because it'd been tested, because they now knew they could survive the thing that they'd been afraid of, because they'd discovered that failure, real failure, not just the theoretical kind, was something they could navigate. That's not a consolation prize. That's what genuine confidence actually looks like. Failure is part of a meaningful career. There's no significant work without some risk of failure, and there's no risk of failure without some risk of the confidence crash that can follow. If you've been through this, if you're in it now, I want you to hear this clearly. The crack in your confidence after failure is not evidence that you were wrong to try. It's evidence that what you tried mattered, and what has cracked can be rebuilt. Not by pretending the crack isn't there, but by understanding it, examining it, and then moving forward carefully, honestly, and with considerably more knowledge than you had before. That's not a consolation prize. That's what resilience actually looks like. I'm John M. Walsh. This is Let's Talk About Confidence. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next episode.